And we are live. Once again, it's on. Good evening, everyone. My name is Paul. With me is Derek. Say hi, Derek.
How's it going, Paul?
Pretty
Excited about
good.
this interview.
I'm excited too, man. I'm excited too. I mean, we've had a really good past month and a half, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
we have been for those of you joining us. Thank you for being here. By the way, we've had a Black comic creators series. We've been interviewing Black comic creators. The thing about the Black comic lords, it's not just about celebrating and educating on Black comic characters and Black comic books. It's also about the Black comic creators that are in the industry. And we've been very blessed to have interviews with Jeffrey Thorne, Cody Ziegler, Dr. Eve Ewing, John Jennings, Stephanie Williams, Aletha Martinez, Nicholas Draper Ivy. Today we just interviewed Dennis Cowan, Joe. I mean, it's just we've been very blessed, and I hope you guys are enjoying these videos. Please, if you're enjoying the content, please like the video, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and certainly comment in the chat, and we'll try and get to all of your questions. Today, we have a legend. I know just about everyone we've spoken to has been a legend, but the interesting thing about the person we're interviewing tonight, and it's kind of a weird analogy. I view him as you review his life story, I really get kind of Forrest Gump vibes. Now, hear me out. Hear me out. What I mean by that. When you go through his life and you hear the stories and places he's worked and things he's done, it kind of reads like a Forrest Gump story. You have this man who's started his career out at Milestone Comics, and he goes in. He's a writer. He's an editor. He's a director. He's a creative architect, public speaker. He's worked for all the major companies, right? DC, Heavy Metal, Lion Forge, mainstream, independent. He's a legend, right? He's currently executive editor at Heavy Metal. He's founder of Illuminous LLC. They're presently working on. He's co-producing the film Xero with 50 Cent's G Unit and Christopher Priest. What we're talking about here is the one and only Mr. Joe Illidge. Hello.
Hey. Sir. Hey, hello. Thank you for that kind introduction, and great to be here.
Oh, it's a blessing to have you, sir. Thank you for being with us tonight.
You're welcome.
As I said, your career has spanned the last 30 years?
Yep. This year is the 30th anniversary of the start of my career in comics. I started at Milestone Media in 1993. And from there, I would go to DC Comics, where I was the first editor of color in the Batman editorial department. From there, I went to different areas of publishing. When I would return to comics, I returned for a short time at a company called Archaea, which would later be bought by Boom Studios. Then I went out of comics again, but stayed in publishing. I got into manufacturing and production and learned how books were put together, because the best content will not be purchased if it's in terrible packaging. We're psychological creatures as human beings. And so we respect paper and printing, paper weight, packaging, special effects. So I learned about book production. I came back to the industry as a columnist for Comic Book Resources, where I did a Black History Month column called The Color Barrier, which evolved into a weekly column called The Mission. After that, I became the senior editor for Lion Forge Comics, where I spearheaded a superhero line called Catalyst Prime. From there, I would go on to Valiant and end up here at Heavy Metal. And then last year, I launched my production company, Illuminous. So it's been an interesting ride throughout the industry and throughout book publishing in general.
Wow. I want to go deeper on each of these experiences you've had, and I'd like you to share with us what you've learned along the way, because I think it's a very interesting story. And let's start with something that's near and dear to my heart, Milestone Media. So it's, what are we talking about? 1993.
Yes.
Milestone drops its first 4 books: Hardware, Icon, Static, and the Blood Syndicate.
Right.
So how did you get involved with Milestone Comics?
So I started at Milestone because in 1992, a friend of mine named Jason Scott Jones, who became the Milestone color editor and is now a producer in television, film, journalism, he was interning at Milestone. He told me about the company. And in those days, internships were free. They weren't paying. You got some kind of a stipend for lunch and enough for 2 transit rides. And I said, well, that sounds pretty cool, but I'm not going to work any place for free. That's not what I'm doing. And I got into a situation where I was fired from a job at an art supply store 3 days after a customer called me a black bastard. And so Christmas 1992, I was unemployed. And so started off in 1993, I was unemployed. And I live in Brooklyn now. I was born and raised in Brooklyn, and I was living in Brooklyn then. And I was walking along Utica
I'm from
Avenue.
Brooklyn too.
All right. So I was walking along Utica Avenue. There was this newsstand on the corner of Utica and Church. I go in there. They got the spinner rack of all these comics, same ones you see: Captain America, the Avengers, Batman. And then I saw Icon number 2. And it had Icon and Rocket surrounded by riot cops. And it had a subline, "Stop, Do Not Hop on Cop," which was a takeoff of Dr. Seuss. And it wouldn't be hyperbole to say that I really had a moment when I saw that comic. I never saw a comic book that validated my existence like that. And I looked at that and I was like, Milestone's going to change the world. And I could either be here on the outside or I could be there with them changing the world. And I was like, crap. And I could just hear like Jason's voice like laughing inside my head at this. And in those days, there were 2 main distributors, Diamond and Capital City Comics. Both of them had catalogs. Diamond had and still has previews. Capital City had one called Advanced Comics. Milestone had these interviews. One of them had a phone number and said basically, like, if you want to join the fight, we're looking for people, call up. I called up.
This is where Derek wants to chime in and show the copy of the previews that you're referring to.
Okay.
Oh gosh, no, you're expecting me to. Okay, all right. Let's see.
Don't act like you don't have it.
I have my copy. Yup.
This one. That's the one.
Yes, indeed. Yes,
All right.
indeed. I still have my copy.
I put everybody on it. That when that previews, it's funny. The reason I interrupt you, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but the reason I interrupt you when you mentioned that previews, which I have, is what is the moment I became a Milestone fan.
Yeah, I mean, just look at that cover.
Yeah,
you had never seen anything like that in comics before.
Right.
Just look at that cover. Look at the attitude of it. Look at the confidence of it. And so I called the number. I spoke to a woman who would end up being my first supervisor, Christine Gilliam, and went in for an interview. And I met Matt Wayne, who was an editor at the time, and Dwayne McDuffie, like a man who would become like a friend and my first mentor. And Matt spoke a lot. Dwayne hardly spoke. He sat behind his desk and he hardly said a word, which made him even more intimidating and mysterious because Dwayne was a tall, stocky dude. And so I thought, okay, I nailed this interview because like this is the interview that I've been born to have. I've been reading comics ever since the first grade. I got this. And it turned out that I had actually shot the interview to hell because I walked in with chips on both of my shoulders. And Jason stuck up for me because they were like, we don't know if this guy is the right guy for our family operation. And he was like, nah, he's a good guy. Give him a shot. So I did, and I was interning for 3 months. Now, at that time, the Metro card in New York did not allow you a free transfer from the bus to the train or vice versa. So they gave us enough money for 2 fares, but I was actually paying 4. I lived in a 2-fare zone. So I was losing money every day that I was interning at Milestone.
Yeah.
But I interned there 3 days a week for 3 months. I did stuff that was fun, and I did stuff that was mundane and boring. But I did it. And one day I walked into the office of the president, Derek T. Dingle, and I said, listen, I really appreciate everything you guys have taught me. It's been a great experience, but I got to hit the pavement and get a job, right? And I went to lunch, and I came back, and he called me in his office, and he told me that the founders had all spoken, and he'd like to offer me a part-time job as his assistant. And I don't know if he saw me crying on the inside, but I was. And so I started on the business side as the assistant to the president. And over time, I would hear Dwayne just drop these pearls of wisdom. I remember one time he called a number of us. It was like 3 lofts. And he called a bunch of us like interns, just like to the center. And he taught us a quick lesson in storytelling. He said, if you have a situation in which there's a gunman on a rooftop and he has a hostage, and in one situation, he's confronted by the Punisher. In one situation, he's confronted by Captain America. And another one, he's confronted by Daredevil. He said, if any 2 of them solve the problem the same way, you're not writing character, you're writing plot.
Right. Wow.
That was just like, bing. And he was like, okay. And he goes back to his office. Right. And so over time, I realized that that's where my place was. My place was with the stories, right? With editorial. And I didn't understand what an editor was. It was a credit that I would see in comics and I would ignore it. It didn't mean anything to me.
So that's actually one of the questions I want to ask you.
Yeah.
Because I think from the fan side of things, no one really knows what an editor does or how important that position or how powerful that position can be. Can you explain what does an editor do, a comic book editor?
Sure. So there are multiple aspects of it. On what I'll call the first level is talent management. So it's working with different creators to make sure that everything comes in on time and that everything has a standard of quality that you do not go below. There has to be a basic standard of quality. It has to come in on time because these books are monthly and there's so many of them out there. If yours is not there, every 4 weeks, someone will go and buy Wolverine, right? So there's that. With talent management comes talent encouragement and elevation. So if you have understanding of the art of comics, which involves understanding writing, understanding art, if you understand these things, you can help creators be better at their job. You can be their support mechanism, sometimes their therapist, but ultimately their ally. And you can help elevate them in their craft and in the outside world. The editor is behind the scenes. The creators are out in the front, right? On the next level is what I'll call intellectual property management. So if you're in the Spider-Man office, your job is to protect the integrity of the intellectual property that is the Spider-Verse and Spider-Man and all the participants within it. All those characters come with rules. Those rules are sacrosanct.
So how does that affect the creative process of the creators that you're also responsible for wrangling and making sure they meet their deadlines, but not stifling their creativity?
So one thing is that if you see someone stepping outside of the rules of the character, have a conversation with them. I think another thing is that you should be able to offer a perspective. So, for example, if I say to you something like, and opinions will differ, but when I was there in the books, Batman did not kill. Batman believes life is sacred. His mother was a social worker. His father was a doctor. Okay? So, and guns are anathema to Batman. So, if I saw some artist having Batman pick up a gun, we would have to have a conversation. And if the artist says to me, well, that's a limitation, I would say, or is it an opportunity for you? Is it an opportunity for you to engage the challenge of Batman not taking a life in a city confronted by people for whom murder is a tempting proposition, right? This is drama. This is character. Character is not presented with the easy conflicts. It's having your value system challenged every single day and you standing with your spine straight and say, I will not cross that line, because if you cross that line, there are consequences. So that is what it would be like. And ultimately, you are a representative of a company, whether that company is Marvel or DC or Dark Horse, or even if it's your own. You are a representative of that company. And so what that company's values are, ideally, you will exemplify them.
Working for Milestone must have been a very interesting experience for you, rewarding experience. You're in essence working with a legendary company, not just a company, but a concept and a benchmark for comics.
Yes,
particularly for comics that focused on people of color.
Yes.
Literally 30 years ahead of its time, and that's not even exaggerating.
It's not.
In terms of the concepts that they were able to do, in terms of race and gender and sexual orientation, they address themes that are just now starting to become more normalized to talk about, and they were doing
100%.
So, what are some of the lessons, or how did that experience affect you, or change, or influence your career subsequent?
It would be fair to say that I did not have what I would call a good grasp of what I would say is my blackness until Milestone. Of course, I knew what I was and I had encountered racism, but in terms of the responsibility to elevate stories of characters of color by creators of color through executives of color, that responsibility as a mission is what Milestone imparted on me. Now, I didn't have that before. And so that purpose was the ultimate lesson that I got from the company. If you want to talk about more of a micro lesson, I would say that we have to be willing to engage what is happening in the world. If you look at the Milestone comics, they were engaging what was happening in the world at the time. They showed a wide range of what Black life in America was, Asian life in America, queer life in America and beyond. So there is a responsibility to engage the world. The comic books can be fantastical, but they should not be so escapist that they do not spark conversation or they do not ignite thought.
Yeah. The concept of you can have edutainment, right?
100%.
So Milestone ended in what, 96, 97 or so? right?
97 was the end of what we'll call the first iteration, Milestone as a publisher of monthly comic books. Yes.
I think I'd seen in a documentary that your last days there, you actually were working for free just so you could get your projects done. You know, just that dedication and loyalty
Yes.
to the company and the subject matter. So, you know, that's really cool that you did that. So what?
Thank you very much. It was the very least that I could have done.
Yeah. Where did you go after that?
So after that, I actually had a 7-week stint in Simon and Schuster's Star Trek department.
I'm a big Trek.
Huh? Oh
I'm
yeah. Listen, I grew up on Trek, right? And so I worked in the Star Trek department, which in 1998 was the red-headed stepchild of Simon and Schuster, because all of the other departments considered it geek corner, but it was the highest profit sector of Simon and Schuster Publishing. So it was the redheaded stepchild that had to be tolerated. Yeah. And so I was there for 7 weeks.
Anyone who's been in a bookstore in the sci-fi section can see the amount of Simon and Schuster Star Trek books that were generated out at that time period. That was like huge.
They were a force.
Yeah.
You know, they had all these different shows. They had novels for every show. And one of my supervisors there, John Ordover, ended up basically creating the first Star Trek crossover event between the novels, because he brought a comic book mindset to the Star Trek prose sector. And then after that, they started doing crossover events with the novels.
What was that crossover event called? Do you remember?
Oh my God. No, I don't remember what it was centered around the captains.
Yeah, I remember that.
One book would be a Picard focused, one was Kirk focused, one was Janeway focused.
Yeah.
So it was a captain centric one, and one may have even been an anthology that included the captain of the Enterprise D from what I'm gonna, consider the best episode of Next Generation, which is yesterday's Enterprise, which I must have watched like 30 times.
Absolutely.
And so I worked there for 7 weeks, learned a lot about the Star Trek fans, the Star Trek ecosystem. And what happened was, before I worked there, I interned. More accurately, I was a temp at DC Comics. I was a temp at DC Comics in 1997. A good friend of mine who was an editor there named Alisan Morales recommended me to temp there. And I temped in the Green Lantern office. And then I also temped in the office that at that time was doing the second Tangent event. And so because I was a temp, my name did not go in any of the books. I didn't get any assistant editor credit. So then after that ended, I went to Simon & Schuster. When I was at Simon & Schuster, Scott Peterson, who was like the number 2 editor in the Batman office under Denny O'Neil, left. He was like, okay, it's time for me to go. And so I went to DC on a Friday to talk to Jordan Gorfinkel. And I said, hey, Gorf, everyone called him Gorf. I said, hey, Gorf, I got this great idea for a 10-page Oracle story for Batman Chronicles. And he was like, okay, that's cool. All right, I want to talk to you about something else. He said, there's an available spot in the Batman editorial office. We need a new associate editor. Would you be interested? What do you say to that?
Yeah.
So I went back to Simon & Schuster, and one of my other supervisors, a woman named Margaret Clark, who was also an editor, I think, at both on DC and Marvel. I said to her, hey, I have a problem. I said, I really appreciate what you guys did for me. You gave me a job when I needed a job, but the Batman office just offered me a job. So I don't know what to do here. And she was like, what are you, crazy? You should run over there and take the job. And I was like, okay. And I did. And I took the job, and that was 1998. And I walked in there in June, and I walked into the beginning of this big 1-year event called No Man's Land. Now, No Man's Land didn't get published until 1999, but we started working on it in 1998.
I remember that story.
And yeah, I mean, No Man's Land was way ahead of its time. And as objectively as I can possibly be, I still don't think there's been a Batman event since No Man's Land that has been as good or better as No Man's Land. And
they tried to recreate it with Zero Year subsequently.
Yeah, Zero Year was good.
Scott Snyder, I think that was
100%. Scott Snyder and I think Greg Capullo at the
Greg Capullo's art. So
but
let me ask you a question.
No Man's Land. Yeah.
When you walk that moment where you walk into the DC offices, right?
Yeah.
I assume, I'm sorry, not the DC offices, the Batman section of DC offices.
Yeah.
I assume Batman has its own, elite section in DC's offices because that's their guy.
There is a section where the Batman editors congregated. He wasn't necessarily on the wall right there, but you could feel his presence because Denny O'Neil's office was there, and we were basically clustered around Denny's office. Yes.
Right. Like 1 out of every 5 DC books is somehow related to the Bat, somehow.
Yeah.
I think the number is. So when you walk into those offices, was there anybody that looked like you?
There was one person in editorial. He was an assistant editor, Lateef Ade Williams. And that was it. I mean, in terms of Batman editorial, to my knowledge, I was the first editor of color ever in Batman. If someone finds some evidence to the contrary, God bless you, but I think you would have to travel through time and change the timeline, right?
What year are we talking about?
It's not going to be the case. We're talking about 1998.
1998, and you're like the first Black editor of Batman.
Yes. So Batman had basically been in publication for 59 years.
Jeez Louise.
Yeah. Wow. So you can imagine that was a heavy responsibility. And if I were going to be perfectly candid with you, there was an aspect of guilt because of DC's role in the surgical dismemberment of Milestone. However, that reinforced my mission even greater because I felt like, well, this is what the founders wanted, right? And what happens is, and this is reality, right? Some people have to fall so some people can move forward.
Yeah.
Right. And so I went in there and I was like, okay, this is Batman. This is the summit, right? This is the summit of quality. This is the standard. And you have to perform at that standard, or you will be used as the excuse to close the doors on people who look like you going forward.
You got to come correct. You got to represent.
Right. I also made the decision to basically be the Sojourner Truth of the Batman department and say, okay, I'm going to bring more people of color to Gotham City. And they're going to be talented so that if they are ever rejected, they will not be rejected on the basis of their work.
That's what's up. Who did you manage to bring in?
Sean Martinborough to Detective Comics. Now, Sean had already been working at DC. He worked on a variety of books. He and Len Kaminsky did a great run on The Creeper. And Sean actually had illustrated a one-shot called Batman the Hill, which was not going to be published because No Man's Land rendered it obsolete. So it was going to go into inventory and never be published. And I looked at that and I said, that book is going to be published. That was a book that was written by Christopher Priest. And it was about Batman going to a section of Gotham that he never went to called the Hill, where the Black people live, because there was a crime that had to be solved. And when he went there, Brothers is like, who's this fool white man in a cape? He's like, I'm Batman. You should be afraid of me. He was like, fool, I'm gonna be afraid of you. Never saw you before.
Yeah, our fellow
Right?
Black comic lord, Rich, he actually put me on that story.
Yeah. So Batman had to confront his own prejudices regarding his city,
Right.
and he had to adapt. And at the end, it was not a white savior story because the power to make the decision to go one way or the other was in the hands of this young Black kid who
Yeah.
wanted to be a screenwriter but got caught up in a world of crime. And so I made sure that book came out. And then when we were revamping the Batman line for the Y2K relaunch, and Detective Comics was going to be the crime noir comic, they had a few other artists in mind. And I was like, no, this is your guy. And I showed them Batman the Hill. I was like, you see that? That's crime noir. That's the person you put with Greg Rucka to make Detective Comics of the year 2000.
So this is the same time that they were redefining, as you said, they were redefining Detective Comics as the noir version of Batman. And you gave them this Black artist and said, this is the guy who's going to give you your style, your look for this.
I was like, that's the guy.
So in essence, you helped redefine Detective Comics as we know it today. I don't think it's understating that.
That would be fair to say.
That's still the formula they use today. So yeah, kudos to you, man.
It's called Detective Comics.
Yeah,
it's supposed to mean that. And listen, again, I was just a facilitator. That decision, I had to go to Denny O'Neil, who was the Batman group editor. We both had to go to Mike Carlin, who was the executive editor. Then it had to go to Paul Levitz, who was the president and publisher. I mean, these decisions have to go through layers, and there was paperwork where you would attach samples of the person's artwork and you would fill out a form and say why you believe this is the right decision. But I knew that was the right decision. So that's part of the job, right? Part of the job is that we help each other, the talented each other, right? It wasn't about, this person's skin color. It was like, this person is the best artist for your vision, right? And even Mark Chiarello, the art director at the time, he was like, totally, that's the guy, right? So those were the kinds of things. Stephen Barnes, well-known novelist who did a book that I loved at the time called Fire Dance, bringing him in for No Man's Land, so those kinds of things. This is part of the whole responsibility thing that I was talking about, right?
Those redefinitions on the Detective Comics, as I said, are still felt to this day. And in fact, the last Batman movie they just did, right? This last one, that was a Detective Comics movie. The director himself said that.
100%.
That style was influenced by those changes that DC decided to make to that book. So that's a pretty significant thing.
Thank you. Yeah, it's good to be able to, when you're doing these things at the time, you have no idea what impact they have. You have no idea how long they will last in the collective memory of the industry or the medium. So it is gratifying to now, 23 years later, to be able to see omnibuses of No Man's Land,
right,
to be able to see that Cassandra Cain Batgirl is such a beloved character, to see these Detective Comics and different things reprinted over and over again, available in print or in electronic form. It's gratifying to know that you did make a difference. You made a contribution. You helped facilitate the forward movement of talented people.
So what was your next move after DC?
So after DC, I was out of comics for a little bit. I actually started working on a production side at a publisher called Watson Guptill, and they were owned by Billboard magazine. But while I was there, what I did was I helped facilitate the development of various art books by comic book creators, one of which was How to Draw Noir Comics by Sean Martinborough, one of which was How to Draw Hip Hop by Damian Scott, and one of which was a cartooning book by Kyle Baker.
Wow.
Yeah. So that was kind of like the beginning of out of comics, but still making a contribution back into comics. It's been this interesting ride, but wherever I went, I brought that with me. And I actually proposed at, as early as 2003, I said to Watson Coates, I said, we should be doing graphic novels.
Right.
And they were like, nah, too niche. Now look at the world we're in, where graphic novels are this dominant portion of book sales. It's become this gateway for young readers. Graphic novels from trade book publishers are outselling everything, right? And so, sometimes you get lucky and you're ahead of the curve.
Dr. Wizard brought up this quote from your website. Just a quote you made. Once we stop viewing graphic novels for adults as a niche, we open the doors to a wider range of possibilities. So expound upon that.
So when you look at the graphic novels that have the highest sales right now, it's kids, middle grade, and then YA, right? The trade book publishers are still trying to crack the code on making adult graphic novels as profitable or near profitable as those other demographics. But the thing of it is, now you just mentioned the latest Batman film, which all these Batman directors cite very particular Batman graphic novels, whether it's Matt Reeves, whether it's Christopher Nolan, whether it's Darren Aronofsky when he wanted to make Batman Year One, right? When you look at the different films and shows that are made from graphic novels, Neil Gaiman's The Sandman on Netflix, Paper Girls at Amazon Prime. When you even go back to a film, the Sam Mendes directed film Road to Perdition with Tom Hanks and early Daniel Craig in his career, that came from a graphic novel, Road to Perdition. And so, graphic novels have the ability to be just as valid in a literary context and have the same amount of gravitas as prose. And so it's not niche. It actually is mainstream.
Yeah.
And so what it will take is, it will take certain publishers to decide to invest today for the long win tomorrow. But the adult graphic novel sector is really one that the industry's trying to crack, right? When you look at someone like Kyle Baker, who years ago did the Nat Turner graphic novel, The Life of Nat Turner, the man was way ahead of the game, right? Because at that time, I think librarians were barely starting to respect graphic novels, because I think that was after Art Spiegelman's Mouse. But you got to remember, for a long time, graphic novels were considered, juvenile and a distraction for young people. So, as opposed to reading real literature. Right. Now, in the 21st century, librarians are like a major advocacy force, right? And yeah, to Azel Ray's point, Death of Captain Marvel and X-Men's God Love Man Kills, those books were next level. That was the first time that X-Men went beyond the metaphor of racism and engaged racism. If you remember that scene early in X-Men God Loves Man Kills of the young black boy's dead body found in the playground, hung up. They went there for the first time. Death of Captain Marvel engaged someone dying from cancer, and the fact that You're not going to be able to stop this from happening. You can bring all the Marvel superheroes together, but this guy's going to die of something as mundane and insidious as cancer. Right? So it's always been this amazing force for storytelling and story communication to the masses. And so that's what I mean. Like, once we realize that and engage that, we blow the doors wide open and the possibilities are truly unlimited.
So we talked about your stint at DC, and
yes,
at that point, you then sort of moved on to the literary world. When did you come back into comics?
I came back in 2007 at a creator-owned focused publisher called Archaea, known as ASP Comics for Archaea Studios Press. And while I was there, that's when I started my professional relationship and developing friendship with Brandon Thomas, because Brandon had a column called Ambidextrous. And in one of those columns, he showed a few images from this character he had called Miranda Mercury. And he said, you know, if I ever got an opportunity to make this is the kind of superhero I would make. And so when I got to Archaea, I asked him, hey, could I acquire projects? He said, yeah. And so I emailed Brandon. I said, you still got that Miranda Mercury idea? He said, yeah. I said, let's do it.
You know, it's funny you should mention that. This is the second time or third time that you've mentioned instances where relationships sort of played a part.
Yes.
How important are relationships in the comic book industry?
They're crucial. And they're crucial for a number of reasons. So one of which is that the comic book industry is not one by which most of its participants will become wealthy. A number of its participants actually live in what I'm going to call the economic fringes, not counting having spouses with 9-to-5 jobs with medical and dental benefits and 401ks, right? A lot of people don't make a lot of money in comics. They're there for the love of comics.
Right.
And so the relationships are part of the glue of that, because that's where we find our kindred spirits. That's where we find like-mindedness, and relationships can develop into friendships. And when you have friends, what you have are advocates, right? So when you're talking about business, the difference between someone realizing their full potential and someone not could come down to one advocate, one person getting them through one door on that day. And from there, they propel themselves toward their full self, right? But there need to be advocates, and advocacy is founded in relationships, right? And creative vision is founded in relationships. Writers and artists meet each other and they're like, hey, this works. Let's just keep working on more projects together. That's how you get the Ed Brubaker and Sean Phillips. That's how you get Scott Snyder and Jock. My goodness. Brian K. Vaughan is a genius, because whoever he pairs up with, he develops a relationship and they all just have this individual quality to them. But, that's what we're talking about. So relationships are one of the cornerstones of the comic book industry, and relationships also connect to Rolodexes. So when you have editors and they have problems that need to be solved, they're going to go to people that they trust to solve problems. They're going to go to people who make them look good to the bosses, will put out good stuff on time, and keep the trains moving.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right?
And this one of the important aspects that, at least me personally, I try to emphasize here when we're doing our things here at Black Comic Lords, is the importance of having people like us behind the scenes. I don't think people really understand how important it is having people Black editors are, having, you know, senior Black writers in these bullpens. When we talk about, or we complain about, particularly with mainstream comics not having the right type of characters, or more representation of Black characters, or better, more involved stories with these characters, more authentic voices for these characters. It really comes down to the fact that there's, quite frankly, to this day, not a lot of representation in the editorial level of these companies.
Not relatively. I will say that I do feel like DC Comics may have more people of color in editorial than they've had in the last 30 years.
Yeah.
There was a time in DC editorial, I was on the tail end of that. There was an era before me where you had a Latino presence.
Yeah.
Then you had a Black presence. You did have some kind of an Asian presence. You had people of color who were very out about being people of color. You had people of color who were not out about being people of color because it was a different time and some people chose to pass, right? But now I think
that sounds like a statement that's replete with a lot of tea.
It's
go there.
It is a reality. You know, the comic book industry is a microcosmic reflection of the nation and the world at large. So the same dynamics that you see in a number of other businesses, you will certainly find in comics. But I will say that DC is definitely on its way up.
Oh yeah,
which is really great to see. You know,
yeah, I think the last 15 years, I think was when that push really sort of. I'm trying to think back to when McDuffie was working over there.
When he was working on Justice
League,
things like that.
I think that was when they started to start to make those inklings around that time.
Yeah, in the middle of the first decade of the 21st century. Yes, absolutely. He was writing, you know, he did the run on Justice League. He wrote Legends of the Dark Knight. He wrote some Firestorm. So they would have him do something here or something there. Justice League, I think, was the first ongoing series they gave him. I mean, of course, it was Dwayne, so he could have written anything.
Yeah,
the man could write anything.
All-star Superman, everything.
Yeah.
All right. So your entry point, you said you came back to Archaea Comics. Where'd you go from there?
So from there, I went back into book manufacturing. I actually worked at a publisher called Sterling, which is owned by Barnes & Noble, and tried to get them to do graphic novels. They said no. Now they're doing graphic novels. So history was repeating itself again. I came back writing a column for Comic Book Resources. At the time, CBR was owned by a guy named Jonah Weiland. Someone dropped his name to me. He's a big basketball fiend. So he literally reached out to me. He said, "Hey, I'm going to be in town tomorrow. I'm going to see a game at Madison Square Garden. You want to get together for a drink?" I said, "Cool." And he said, "Hey, I'd like you to think about writing a column for us, for Black History Month, about the kind of things that you talk about when you do these interviews, right?" And I said, "Okay." So I did it. I did 6 of them. I was supposed to do 4 because, 4 weeks, Black History Month. And then he was like, "Do another one." And I did. And he was like, "Do another one." And I did. And he was like, "We got something here." And he said, "Why don't we just make it a regular thing?" Right. And so I called it The Mission. Right. And I was talking about the politics of representation in comics at every level: executive, creative, fiction, parent companies. And it would be fair to say, listen, the column was prescient. That's just a fact. I had people who would reach out to me on the side and say, hey, you're making an impact.
Yeah.
Like, I had a conversation at Marvel today because of one of your columns. Like,
right.
It was part of the larger conversation. This conversation, this column that I did was really inspired by people like Brandon Thomas, and a guy named David Brothers, who now at Viz Media, who was saying certain things in the industry before I started my column. So I was by no means the first. There were people who showed me that it was possible, but I took it to a very particular place through, the prism of my viewpoints, and it really hit something. It started touching some of the red buttons, right? And so then what happened was, because of that column, David Stewart II and Carl Reed, who founded Lion Forge, reached out to me and said, hey, we, were inspired by Milestone. We'd like to do a superhero universe. Would you come here and steer the way?
And this is with which company?
Lion Forge.
Lion Forge. And that's Catalyst Prime.
Yeah, Catalyst Prime. And so you can imagine that was a irresistible proposition. It was something that I felt was my debt to the founders of Milestone, who gave me my first opportunity, but also to the industry that gave me a place in the world, right? So I was like, the world needs heroes. The world needs the full range of heroes. And so I took a note from the television industry and I created the Catalyst Prime Writers Room. And so that writers room had, some of the genius minds of our industry: Christopher Priest, Brandon Thomas, Amy Chu, Alex DeCampi, David F. Walker, Dr. Sheena Howard.
It was in essence Milestone kind of, I don't want to say 2.0, but like Milestone 1.5,
It was 1.5, 100%.
Right.
And that's exactly what it was meant to be. It was a tribute to them and a continuation of their philosophy. And so we did it. It lived for a time. It gave people work. And people were able to then be around a little longer to find other opportunities and go on. And so it was the continuation of the mission. And Noble was the flagship title. Right. And Brandon Thomas was the writer. That he was the first person that I went to.
Dope series, dope concept. I really had a lot of love for Catalyst Prime. It is, look, I'm spoiled because for me, Milestone is the benchmark.
Fact.
For comics. Fact. I mean, that's my personal opinion, but I've seen a lot of companies try to emulate that style, and more power to them. We need someone to do that and emulate what they've did. I don't think anyone's done it yet, honestly. I mean, there's a lot of great talented books and companies that are out there, but for me personally, just my personal opinion, Milestone's the pinnacle. No one's reached that yet. I thought Catalyst Prime was kind of in that trajectory. I mean, in terms of the quality of what they were doing, being on a regular schedule and what have you, the things that make a company successful.
Thank you so much. Everyone put their heart into it. People across different departments, marketing, sales, social media,
right.
People really put their heart into it. And as you pointed out, Milestone will never be surpassed because it was the first one like it. Was it the first Black-owned publisher? Absolutely not.
No.
You have to look at the publishers of Brother Man Comics. You have to, look at Ania. Milestone wasn't the first. What Milestone was the first one to have a publishing deal with an industry giant, which was DC Comics. But there was such an urgency to those books, and you could feel it. It was visceral. And I will say this with my dying breath. There is not a #1 superhero monthly comic produced by an American publisher that is superior to Hardware #1. There is not. You
Facts.
will not find it. Hardware
Absolutely.
#1 is the perfect superhero comic book. And it says so much in one issue that scholars can still be talking about it 20 years from now.
How many comics on the first page is giving you inklings of Maya Angelou's "I Know Why a Caged Bird Sings"? I mean, that's
dude,
like the first page.
Dude, you know, it's kind of like the thing, you know, there are things that you watch, movies, TV shows, there's books that you read, and you remember lines.
Yeah.
Right? There's a line in Hardware 1, I will never forget it, and it is this: escape is impossible until one perceives all of the barriers.
Wow. Yeah.
That is an existential truth.
Yeah.
And you don't have to be Black for it to be an existential truth. You just have to be a person that feels trapped.
The quality of writing and art in Milestone is just, man, it just if they had not closed and just kept making out books, and I honestly could have been quite content just only reading Milestone comics. I probably would have been fine.
I hear you. You know, I've come to learn that the things that we see as bad at the time happen for a reason, and the reason will be revealed later. It took the absence of Milestone to illuminate the need for a static animated cartoon.
Yeah.
And the static animated cartoon changed everything. Everything. I've spoken to people who told me the static cartoon changed the direction of their lives. They were going in one direction and they saw a static and it sent them in the other direction.
Wasn't Static the first Black male superhero lead titled cartoon?
Probably as a solo character. I mean,
as a solo character,
a really deep dive. I'm 53 years old. So in the 70s, I think there was a cartoon called Super Stretch and Micro Woman. Right?
Yeah, I remember that.
And that was a married Black couple,
yeah.
Right? And you had Black characters as parts of teams. Obviously, you had Black Vulcan, open parentheses, Black Lightning, close parentheses. But in terms of a Black lead-led character cartoon, superhero. Not Rickety Rocket, but superhero.
In a self-titled cartoon.
I do believe Static Shock was the first.
I think he was the first.
Right?
And it's not like there's been that many afterwards.
Listen, and I'll tell you something. I had to do a confidential project for Warner Brothers a few years back. I can never really publicly say like what it was or what it was for, but all I can say is it required that I watch all the episodes of Static Shock. This is 2 years ago, and when I tell you, it still hits.
Yeah, absolutely.
It still hits, man. There's this episode where Static is thrown back in time, and he tries to save his mom and fails. That breaks you, man.
Yeah.
Because
thank God it's on HBO Max now.
Dude, the kid, his mother was his North Star. His mother was the example of what a hero was. And he was like, no matter what I do with Static, I'll never be the hero my mom was. Come on, man.
No, Azel Ray, Brown Hornet, as much as I love Brown Hornet, does not count.
Right. We love Brown Hornet.
I mean, I love Brown Hornet just like I love Verb from Schoolhouse Rock. I mean,
exactly. Yeah.
You grew up in the 70s. Those were your Black cartoon character representation.
I could take a noun and bend it, right? So, yeah, Verb was great, but no, I think Static Shock was the first, and so it wouldn't have went that way, I don't think, if Milestone wasn't gone.
Yeah.
To then have Static stick out, right? And so these things that happen, the windfalls come later. The aha moments reveal themselves later, right? And now Milestone's back.
Yes, they are.
And unfortunately, it outlived Dwayne, but he would have wanted that. That's what, when you talk about generational wealth is not just money. Generational wealth is not just real estate. Generational wealth is intellectual property.
Yeah.
Right? That's part of generational wealth. So this is what they fought for. When Dennis Cowan first dreamed up the idea, I would imagine this is what he hoped for.
Yeah. So after you left Lion Forge, where'd you go?
After I left Lion Forge, I was at Valiant for a dramatic and spectacular 9-month run. And during that time, we did Livewire.
Vita
So, oh yeah, listen, Vita brought it, right? Like Valiant never did a comic like Livewire, and they will never ever do another comic book like Livewire, right? Because what happened was, when I got to Valiant, it was at the end of this crossover called Harbinger Wars, and so basically Livewire, this black woman, was viewed as a terrorist because she did something to save her people, and she was, branded public enemy number 1. So imagine like you walk into a company and it's like, here's a superhero universe, and the black woman is hunted by every government agency known to man. What the hell do you do with a piece of dung like that? You get Vita Ayala and you get the right team together and you craft a story that is potent. You craft an amazing story, right?
Was that one of Vita's earliest jobs? Was working on Livewire?
Not earliest jobs. Vita had done a lot of things, I think, for Black Mask, short stories for DC Comics, but I believe this was their first ongoing series. And it's one that, as part of my editorial career, I'm quite proud of. Again, the team came together, and Carl Bowlers, who was a senior editor at Valiant, brought the artists that did these amazing covers. So, again, it was a situation where I was there, I was able to make a difference and continue the mission and continue on.
All right. So then after Valiant, you said you're there for 9 months. So what was the next move?
After Valiant, there was a short stint at a company called A Wave Blue World. And then after that was the next big thing, which was heavy metal.
Yeah. That's where you're at now.
Which was huge, because I first discovered heavy metal at the age of 13. I was a student at New York City's High School of Art and Design in Manhattan. And I was 13 years old, and someone showed me an issue of heavy metal, and I had never seen anything like that before, because I grew up on a steady diet of superheroes, Marvel and DC. So here was heavy metal, this magazine. It had these artists from the European Union and Italy, and I was like, whoa. I was like, first of all, this is too mature for me to take home. If my mother finds it, she's going to kick me out of the house, because she's going to say, my son is bringing home pornography. But heavy metal started to open my eyes to the artistic possibilities of what could happen in the comic book medium. And from there on, we would see changes in the industry. We would see Marvel's Epic magazine and Epic line. We would see the birth of Vertigo, which is, in the history of comic books, it's got to be one of the 5 most influential imprints in the history of comics, and you could probably say entertainment at large. And so heavy metal was the beginning. And so when I got the opportunity to work at Heavy Metal as their executive editor, the magazine had kind of been in a weird place. It wasn't the paragon that it used to be. There's a line at the top of every issue, the world's greatest illustrated magazine. And when I got there with the new management, it was no longer that. And so part of the job was to restore the artistic standard of heavy metal. And so it was the world's greatest illustrated magazine, but could it also be the world's greatest story magazine, right?
Well, let's talk about that, because we have this book that's on the screen, Entropy.
Yes.
And your job is to try and, you know, breathe new life into heavy metal.
Right.
Who's a writer on this book to help bring that story to life?
So the writer is none other than Christopher Priest. You know, Priest and I are good friends. Priest is definitely partially responsible for my career as one of the original co-founders of Milestone.
Yeah, the fifth Beatle.
And yes, history has designated him the fifth Beatle, but he was there first. When he was working at DC Comics as an editor for their Impact line, which was the time that DC Comics had the license to the Archie characters like the Fly and the Shield and whatever, he would do that by day, and by night he'd be working on what was the first iteration of the Milestone Bible. So he was one of the first, and he parted ways with the founders before the company started publishing in February 1993, but the presence of Priest is within the DNA of the Dakota universe. And so then, as you know, we reconnected when we worked together on Batman the Hill, and so Lion Forge, of course. And so when we successfully relaunched Tarna, myself and the chief creative officer at the time, David Irwin, and the CEO and the CCO said, hey, we want to expand the Tarna universe. We want to create an enemy, a nemesis for Tarna. And so I said, okay, you know who would be great for this? I said, Christopher Priest. I said, he just finished a 50-issue run on Deathstroke, which was nominated for an Eisner Award.
Right.
And, you know, it's funny, when you mention Priest, people are usually impressed by Black Panther, Spider-Man versus Wolverine, whatever. But they were like, you know, the CEO was like, he got to write a villain comic?
Yeah.
And basically have Deathstroke get away with murder in a world in which Superman and Batman exist. And he almost got one of the most coveted awards of the industry. He was like, yeah, let's get him. So I, you know, reached out to Priest and said, you know, hey, you want to take this on? And so we talked about it. We had a few talks and we found the thematic angle. And then he said, okay, you know, and, you know, for him, you know, it's always great to work with highly talented, highly intelligent people. It's great to see how their brains solve problems and you learn from them. You know, that's another thing. When you're an editor working with talented people, it's osmosis. You know, the learning goes in both directions. So
That's how I feel working with Dr. Wizard down there every day in Black Comic Lords.
Oh man, that's awesome. I mean, that's the way it should be, right? Relationships are reciprocal by nature, and so, you know, working with people like him, you know, make me a better editor. And so Entropy #1 came out. Heavy Metal is going through a major reorganization right now. I can't even really speak about it out of respect for the new CEO and the new chief operating officer, but I feel confident that you will see Entropy again. The whole series is basically done, all 5 issues, it's a pretty amazing story, and it's a story about really how do you create a villain? Not how do you create a villain in an obvious way. How do you create a villain in an unobvious way? For me, the closest analogy,
this guy starts out as like a regular, family guy.
exactly, right? So the closest analogy is Breaking Bad, right? The Walter White of Breaking Bad episode 1 and the Walter White of season 3, the final episode, those are two different people. Or are they? Or is it the same person who became actualized over time? These are the questions when you're creating a villain. Does someone become somebody else, or does someone become who they always were?
Right.
Right. So Entropy will answer that question. To answer Mark Robinson's question, yes, I was aware of the Heavy Metal movie. It came out in 1981. I think I saw it in 1982 on VHS. And that was the first time I saw anything like that in animation. And again,
I wasn't allowed to watch that movie.
Well, I was just about to say, I have family in the Bahamas, and I actually watched it at my aunt's house. I think it was like 8 o'clock at night. So I was in the den. Some of my family was out, and some of them were in their rooms, and that's how I got to watch Heavy Metal. I did not get to go to the theater. I watched it on VHS tape. But yes, I was definitely aware of the Heavy Metal movie, and it was because of that movie that when I got to Heavy Metal, one of my first creative goals was to reintroduce the Tarna character who appeared in that film, because when you think of Heavy Metal, you think of that film, and Tarna is kind of like their tip of the spear character. What I would say to people at the company is Tarna is to Heavy Metal what Batman is to DC Comics. Batman is very clearly the tip of the spear of the DC superhero universe in publishing and in cinema until James Gunn does what he does. Right? Until he does what he does and makes Superman the tip of the spear. But at this moment in time, Batman, by virtue of related characters, by virtue of presence across, animation, film, and by virtue of the money that Batman makes, is the tip of the spear of the DC superhero universe across media, right? So that's what Tarna is to Heavy Metal. And so I was definitely influenced by the Heavy Metal film. Yes.
All right. So you also have another project you're working on right now. You started your own company.
Yes.
Can you tell us about that, and what's that major project that you're working on?
So I launched my production company, Illuminous, last year. And the project that I launched it with, that we announced out the gate in Deadline, was for a film franchise based off of a comic book called Xero, Xero, that was created and is owned by Christopher Priest. It was published 1997 and 1998. So my company, Illuminous, is doing Xero with 50 Cents, G Unit Film and Television, Christopher Priest, and Color Farm Media. So Color Farm Media is owned by Erica Alexander, definitely a legend in entertainment through Living Single. She's now killing it on Wu-Tang, an American Saga, and she's got a documentary out, The Big Payback, about reparations, and her business partner, Ben Arnon. So we are the partners in bringing Xero to the big screen, or the small screen these days because of streaming.
It was an interesting backstory of how this came to be, right? Like DC owned this property, the IP on this, because you mentioned IP is how important it is.
Right. They did not own the IP. This was a special kind of deal.
Okay.
And it's not that dissimilar from the Watchmen deal. So the Watchmen deal was that if DC stopped publishing Watchmen for a period of time, the rights would revert to Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons. What happened is Watchmen became this runaway locomotive and a perennial hit. So DC never stopped publishing it, so the rights never reverted. What happened with Xero was that Christopher had the rights to the IP, but DC held the publishing rights. If DC chose to not reprint or publish new Xero content over a period of time, the publishing rights would revert to Christopher Priest, and they did.
That's what having a good agent can get you.
So we were able to have the conversation with 50 and not have to involve Warner Brothers at all.
Yeah.
Because the rights reverted to Priest. Now, the fact of the matter is, it was published by DC. Xero actually existed in the DC universe. Issue 6 was part of a crossover, I think, called The Final Night. So Xero met Dr. Polaris. But Christopher had the freedom to shop it wherever he wanted. So we're now working with G Unit Film and Television. And, you know, what's really been interesting is it's one thing to know from a distance the inner workings of how things get made in Hollywood. But when you are behind the curtain and you see it's really educational, nothing is instant. Everything takes time. And last year, as you may know, the entertainment industry, it was rendered into a state of chaos. There were mergers. There were mass layoffs that are continuing to today. There were reorgs. Even today, Disney just announced how they have re-envisioned the company as 3 very specific departments. Here are the people who are running the departments. So this is a time in which we can develop Xero outside of last year's chaos. And so we're talking to some very interesting writers, because that's where it's going to start. It's going to start with the writer, the person who has the right vision, then the director, and then we can get moving. But with everything, it always starts with the nucleus. So you have the comic book, and then you have the writer who can take that material, but then take it to another level because of the medium that it's in and because of the times that we're living in, right? And so,
do you think there will be like a production at the same time where you're going to do comics to help promote the movie franchise?
Definitely. That's really? Without question. That's without question. That will happen.
That's huge.
That's part of the plan. Yes.
And then there was a deal, or at least there was a relationship before with DC. Now with you mentioned chaos. With chaos, there's always opportunity as well. With the chaos
100%.
With James Gunn in DC, is there an opportunity to open the doors to have that character be included as part of that universe to some degree?
Well, absolutely, because James Gunn was very clear about the fact that there are DC projects that are going to be outliers, and they're going to be under the banner of DC Elseworlds.
Right, the Elseworlds, right, exactly.
There is no reason that there's not a possible future in which Xero is done through Warner Brothers and is part of the Elseworlds, which, by the way, wouldn't that be the ultimate story, right? Of like the character returning home in the next incarnation, right? In this new millennium, in this new renaissance of comic book intellectual properties as widescreen entertainment. Like, come on. I'd love that.
And the story is crazy. So, for those of you who aren't familiar with the premise of Xero, he's like this black assassin who, let's say he's at a dinner party in a tuxedo, and he's got to murder somebody there. He's got to assassinate somebody there. He will switch his visage to a white man, a blonde-haired, blue-eyed white man, and then do the assassination. So, and then switch back to himself. So in essence, he's invisible to those who are around him.
Basically, he is Yahya Abdul Mateen II wearing the skin of Chris Hemsworth.
That sounds like foreshadowing of your cast.
Who, me? So, but that's what we're talking about. We're talking about someone using state-of-the-art prosthetics to get access to those places,
right,
where we are not allowed, right? And you're dealing with duality, right? Like, the more you wear that skin, the more you lose what's under that skin. I mean, hopefully a number of people have read Xero. If not, they will rediscover it in time. But there is a thing that happens to him in the very first issue that begins the reawakening of his blackness, of his humanity, and his agency as a human being.
Yeah.
And as he starts to reawaken, everything that represents the infrastructure of his life is rendered in peril. So we basically have this spy superhero story, which is really about the kind of things that James Baldwin spoke about, that W.E.B. Du Bois spoke about, that Ta-Nehisi Coates writes about. And we can tell that story now because we're now in a world in which any Black Panther film makes $1 billion, and HBO did a Watchmen show that taught most of America about the Tulsa Race Massacre.
A lot of people didn't know about that until they saw that.
Yeah, but you and I we knew about Black Wall Street for years. But America, nope. That one was hidden in a box, the same box that they usually put Malcolm X in. Like, MLK doesn't have to be in the box. But Malcolm, put him in the box, put Huey Newton in the box, put Angela Davis in the box. You know what I mean?
Right. Well, one of the most important sort of stories from this lessons learned from this experience with Xero is, and you've brought this up before, is the importance of ownership of IP. And I think, Derek, you had a slide that you were showing us before. We're seeing that comics are one of the main food groups of the film, TV, and game industries. Creators are looking at that and they're thinking about their future. That future is based in IP ownership. Can you expound upon that?
Sure. So, a lot of people say like IP. They say it all over the place. And what it means is intellectual property. I like to view intellectual property the same way we view actual property, like real estate, right? If you've read The Case for Reparations, the long form article by Ta-Nehisi Coates, you learn what it took for Black people to be able to own property in the United States. And that was a history that was full of murder, of banishing, of legal theft. So the ownership of physical property, real estate, is empowerment because it's something that you can pass along to your kids, they pass along to their kids, and it has value that can appreciate. So now let's talk about intellectual properties. Let's talk about The Walking Dead.
Mm-hmm. Robert Kirkman.
Robert Kirkman was a guy who wrote for Marvel and DC. And he did a video that was a manifesto, I think back in 2011, where he basically put forth the gospel, the cause of the importance of ownership. Obviously, that was preceded in the 90s by the founders of Image Comics, who changed everything. That would also be preceded by such visionaries as Neil Adams, who fought for creator rights and owned his own characters with Continuity Studios. And so when you have your own creations that you own, that means that when it comes to profit sharing, you will have maximal profit sharing as opposed to minimal profit sharing or no profit sharing. It means that you can control the destiny of it. It means that that one property could lead to others. And that can be the financial foundation for your wealth, for the wealth of your children, for you to be able to set up institutions and businesses that will outlive you. That's the importance. And creators are seeing that. They're seeing enough examples of it to know that a shift is possible. You can shift your life from a life of dependency to a life of independence.
Yeah, one of the things that you mentioned was Image Comics.
Yes.
For those of you who really aren't familiar with some of the history on that, you have this period of time in the early 90s where you have these, for all intents and purposes, super creators, superstar, rock star creators. Jim Lee and Todd McFarlane, Rob Liefeld, and Jim Valentino, Mark Silvestri. I know there's another name I'm forgetting there, but these guys. Yeah, Eric Larson.
And Eric Larson. Yep, it was 7.
These guys were superstars. They had followings. They could write their own tickets at Marvel and DC, and so they realize that they're making these companies a whole lot of money. You know, yep. They're revolutionizing characters that they don't own. Jim Lee's work on the X-Men revolutionized the X-Men, so much so that they based an entire cartoon on his designs that he does not get a penny for. At least if it is, it's probably literally a penny. Todd McFarlane revolutionized Spider-Man. Today, even something as simple as the way Spider-Man's webbing is drawn, Todd McFarlane was the first one to do that.
Preach. He was the first one that got it right. If you read the official handbook of the Marvel Universe and you read the scientific principles behind Spider-Man's webbing, and I'm going deep geek here, Todd was the first person that actually drew it correctly. Whether that was intentional or not, he was the one that matched the science of Spider-Man's webbing. My apologies for the interruption.
No.
Just had to give the Todd father his due respect.
It's the Black Comic Lords. Deep dives is what we do. So, you know, these guys revolutionized these characters that they were, you know, working on, and they weren't getting extra bread as a result. So they're like, why don't we just assemble our own thing and do our own company? We've got the following. They're in a position, because they already had a following, to leave these companies, start their own production company, their own image studios. And they did a very unique deal where each of these major artists would have their own sub studio. And it was like, it was almost like I don't want to use the term pyramid scheme, but it was like, because that's pejorative, but it was like you would be the leader of your studio, and within that studio, you could hire other artists and writers, and they would kind of, it was the 90s, so everyone would try to emulate the style of the head of the studio. So you have a bunch of sub Jim Lee guys. You'd have a bunch of sub Todd McFarlane guys. You'd have a bunch of sub Rob Liefeld guys, and et cetera, et cetera. I think the only one who wasn't emulated was Eric Larson. He's like, I'll do my own thing. I'll do my own work, or whatever.
That's right. Yep.
So, you know, and they got to own their intellectual property in perpetuity. Jim Lee got a Wildcats cartoon. Todd McFarlane had an HBO cartoon and did a movie with Spawn. Rob Liefeld had his what was it called? Youngblood. Youngblood even had a cartoon at one point.
Youngblood did have a cartoon. That's right.
So,
as did Savage Dragon.
Right, and Savage Dragon. And that sort of changed. It was so important. The reason I'm going on at length for this is so important that the big two, Marvel and DC, had to change their business paradigm to an extent to have some type of profit sharing. And I wanted to get your insight on this, because from what I understand, they changed it to an extent. But how does it work today with writers and artists? They create characters for Marvel and DC. I see, for example, with Marvel, you'll watch these red carpet premieres of these MCU movies,
Right.
and then they'll bring out this artist or this writer who did something definitive on the character that they had borrowed or used or was influenced in this movie. So they'll bring this creator out to the red carpet premiere. And ostensibly, they would often say, well, how much are you making off of? I mean, all this pomp and circumstances, movie's making $1 billion. How much did you get? Marvel paid me, $2,000 for the work that I did that they influenced this film. They gave me an extra $2,000. Like, that's it. Yep. Are they making deals now in light of the MCU? Has Marvel and DC changed their paradigm so that creators can get more royalties, so to speak, off of characters that not that are existing IP per se, but if they create a new character within that company, and I know it's considered sort of pay for play type thing, but if they create a new character, do they get like a larger profit? How does that work?
Okay, so the first thing that we should establish is if you're working for Marvel and or DC and you create characters, it's under work for hire. Marvel and DC owns those characters. And to a larger extent, Disney and Warner Brothers Discovery owns those characters. However, during the Paul Levitz era, when he was a president publisher at DC Comics, he understood, possibly because he was a creator himself, because, Paul's a well-known writer in 20th century DC, that for a long time, comic books were dismissed by society. And as a result, so were comic book artists. And at the end of the day, as human beings, some of the basic things we need are appreciation and reciprocity, right? So if you co-create a character that ends up in a TV show, and one day you just get a check for $10,000 with like corporate letterhead that says, thank you for your contribution for the DC universe. This is a show of our appreciation. This just comes in the mail one day, right? You don't own that character, but it makes you feel appreciated and respected.
Yeah.
And you know what you're going to do? The next day, you're going to say, man, I'm going to create some more characters for DC. I'm not going to own them, but I know they're going to break me off some decent checks. Reportedly, the Marvel checks, the numbers are not as high. Yes. There are still checks, of course, but there are definitely infamous interviews with various creators where they've discussed these things. And some of them have actually discussed a comparison between what a MCU check would look like and a DCEU check would look like, right? So those structures are in place. And I think it influences creators' decisions. I mean, Marvel is such a powerful brand that I feel like there are so many people, they just want to work for Marvel. There's a Brazilian artist who will say, ever since I was 8, I wanted to do Spider-Man. Oh, I'm going to get to do Spider-Man? Cool. I don't care if Spider-Man No Way Home comes out and I co-create a character in there and you don't break me off hardly anything.
That is the paradigm now with the what do you call them, the Stormbreakers, what have you. They're like, that's kind of what Marvel's doing.
They want to do the characters. Okay, cool. Right? That's okay. It's part of the fun. But we're now in a time in which the creators have to be business people. They have to think about their futures, and they may be engaging in what George Clooney used to call the one for them, one for me. So he would say, I'll make Peacemaker for you, and then I'll make Solaris for me, or something like that.
Yeah.
So that way it's like I give to the system, and then I make something for my system. I hope that more creators are thinking that way, so that at the same time as they build their careers, they build the pathways to their future. There's a young creator I was speaking to a week or so ago, got a really big announcement. And, publicly, I said, congratulations. Privately on a DM, I said, okay. The last thing I said to him, I said, get yourself a financial counselor. Yeah, because Gotta learn about how money works. Gotta learn about setting your money up so that when you get to a certain age, you don't have to pick between food and medication. Right? And the comic book industry is not an apparatus that provides financial education for its participants.
Right. Right.
You know?
I like that advice. Do something for, the check, and use that check to help fund your own project. But that own project, let that be your own. Let that be your IP. You can build your following over here in this mainstream book. Get your name out there. Have everyone recognize who you are. Develop a portfolio of work. Still getting a regular check. But then don't sign an exclusive deal. Like, make sure that you can still do your own intellectual property over here. And eventually that following, like for Image, that following you got with the mainstream, you can also do it with your own thing. And if that thing blows up, your checks go that much further.
Which has happened again and again and again. Last week, I think there was an announcement that Criminal, the Image series by Ed Brubaker and Sean Phillips, is going to be developed as a series, I think, by Amazon.
Right.
And Ed Brubaker and Sean Phillips, or Ed Brubaker definitely, I mean, he really became elevated not only for his work at DC Comics on Gotham Central with Greg Rucka, but when he was doing Captain America
which
comics, right? That really helped shoot him up to the stratosphere, so that when he went independent, it's like, okay, Ed Brubaker's a known quantity. We know what we're going to get. Anything he puts out, we're buying it, we're buying it, we're buying it. Right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. Well, what's the next one you had here, Dr. Wizard?
So is 50 very hands-on, or is he someone you meet and he has good people to handle production? Both. We've had meetings where he has sat in on the meetings through verbal presentations, and he does trust his lieutenants. So we've had some meetings without him. I mean, the dude's pretty busy. Like, you talk about an empire. I mean, he's basically teaching television the language of spinoffs. Now you've got the Yellowstone universe, and I think they just announced there's going to be a Billions universe and a Dexter universe. Well, before that, there was a Power universe, and now you're going to get a BMF universe. And who did that? 50, right? So that guy is busy as heck. That doesn't count when he goes to the Super Bowl and hangs upside down, right? So he's busy. So to answer your question, Mark, he's both. And it's been really cool working with him. No, I did not say there were black creators that chose to pass as white. I said that there were creators of color that chose to pass as white. I didn't say they were black.
Without naming names, I think I know who you're talking about. James tweeted about looking at a myriad of characters from DC stable, including Milestone. Yes.
Well, that's good, because, last I heard, there's a Static film in production, which is being co-produced by Michael B. Jordan and his production company. It's really interesting to see the characters that Gunn chose to put out the gate first. I think there's a lot of conversations to be had. But you know what? Now we're seeing clarity of direction, and no matter what you think about it, whether you think it's right or wrong, there's a value in that.
Yeah.
Once you have clarity of direction, you can make the moves. But when you don't have a plan and you're literally making up the plan film after film, that's not going to work out.
Yeah, I would hope that if Milestone does cut a deal with Warner Brothers to do their films, that it is under that the auspices of that Elseworlds concept. They do an Earth M, and
right.
I don't particularly need to see Superman or Batman in the Milestone universe. I could care less. I want to see the Milestone universe. We've seen all these other characters. I want to see the Milestone universe. The extent that I want to see Superman is what I saw in Icon.
Right, with the Worlds Collide crossover.
Yeah, no, I'm talking about the Milestone 2.0 Icon and Rocket.
Got you. Yeah,
I don't want to give a spoiler, but that's as much Superman as I want to see.
Fair.
If you read it, you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah. So BCL Star Dancer Supreme. Does the Milestone Bible still exist? It exists for the people who have copies of it. I have a copy of the Milestone Bible, which is made up of a number of mini Bibles. I actually have Bibles of series that never came to pass.
Is that Milestone Bible like what's the term I'm looking for? Is it copyrighted? Is it something is there an NDA on it that still exists?
I would imagine so, because it's just like a Batman Bible or a Bible for House of the Dragon, a television show. It's like, this has confidential information about how we're going to manage these intellectual properties. It has story ideas. If these ideas were to be made public, someone were to duplicate them, whether intentionally or unintentionally, that's when you get into legal entanglements and litigious happenings. And so it's really best to keep it contained. So even though that was an earlier iteration of Milestone, that document is not for public dissemination. It's probably the same reason why the famous DC style guide, the visual style guide by Jose Luis Garcia Lopez, will never, ever be printed as a book for public sale, because his visual representations of the DC characters are so seminal to how DC rolled out over years that it's like, you don't throw that out into the world.
Right. It'd be nice if Milestone at some point could release a somewhat redacted version or excerpts from the Bible, just to see the machinations and inner workings of what Dennis Cowan and Dwayne McDuffie and Christopher Priest were thinking when they came up with some of these concepts.
The closest that you will get is there was an issue of Comics Buyer's Guide that came out in 1993, and it actually had excerpts from the Milestone Bible. And
I think that was actually 1992. And
right.
My boy Richard has it, and he throws it in my face every time I say, I got the earliest Milestone from previews. He goes, yes, not so fast.
That's right, because in that Comics Buyer's Guide, Icon was called Paragon.
Correct. Right.
And then that name had to be changed. I think there was another character named Paragon.
That's literally what Dennis Cowan told me several hours ago.
Yeah, but there are the narratives of the characters that are in that article are from the Milestone Bible. That is the closest that you will get to a package that collects elements from the document. And if you have that, that's a pretty cool package.
That's Richard laughing at me right now. Yes, Richard, your book predates mine. I mean, I get that. Derek, was there another quote we're going to go review? Here we go. Most of the world thinks that Black excellence began with the Black Panther film, but it's more than that.
That's a fact.
That is
right.
That is an absolute fact. It's amazing.
Yeah, I mean,
particularly in these spaces and Black comic lore and social media, how many people have sort of jumped on the bandwagon of loving Black comics or these characters because they saw the Black Panther film in 2018. And it's a good and a bad thing. I mean, there are worse problems to have. You've got more interest in Afrofuturism and Black characters and Black characters in comics, which is cool. But a lot of these people that are sort of new to the hobby or the genre are unfamiliar with the rich history that way predated all of this. What's your feeling?
Exactly. They're unfamiliar with the history, just as they were unfamiliar with the Tulsa Race Massacre.
Yeah.
And they don't have a full awareness of the people that are out there now creating the new Black Panthers of tomorrow.
Right.
And so that was part of the reason why my partners and I created the access guide to the Black comic book community, because my partner Demetrios Fragiskatos, who owns 2 stores, Anyone Comics in Brooklyn, New York, and Everyone Comics in Queens, New York, and George Carmona III, who is a journalist, a designer, and he's OG Milestone. He worked at Milestone with us in the 90s. we came up with the idea. It started with Demetrios and it evolved with the three of us to create a book that would be a gateway for the lay person to discover all these Black creators, their comic books, how other publishers are elevating Black characters, Black creators, Black-owned comic book stores, Black-owned conventions. There's a whole world out there. And when you walk out of any theater after seeing Black Panther or Wakanda Forever, that's only the beginning of the journey for you. And if you are familiar with a bit of the history before, but you want to find out more, like who are the players? Who's doing cool things out there? The book is the gateway to show you that. And, you know, once you know that things exist, you seek them out and you support them. Once you meet the people who make these things, you find kindred spirits and you want to support them. You know, you talked about relationships. One of the important relationships in this industry is the relationship between the creators and the people.
Right.
Right. When they meet people like us and we realize that, you know, we like a lot of the same things, you know, we have the same viewpoints on a lot of things. They want you to win. They want to support you because they want you to win, right? So this book, these books, will help everyone find the people who are creating the new important Black characters of the next 20 years.
Yeah, it really. I have this book myself. I have the second edition that came out. I'm proud to say I was a Kickstart supporter, so my name's actually in the back of it. That's
Thank you very much.
I appreciate that. But this is a dope book. For those of you who don't have it, this is like the who's who of the Black comic book community. Richard Wright says, "Can you include influencers?" Hint, hint, BCM.
Oh my God! I mean, they're so.
I will say, I was disappointed we were not included in the 2021, 2022.
Fair. I mean,
I saw some names in there. I'm like, they made it, but we didn't make the cut.
You know what? I take all the bullets that are due because we do the best that we can. We don't catch everybody, but what we say is, if we miss you, just call us out on it. So you go to the list for the next one. There's, you know, it's like, listen.
So is there going to be another one?
Root up. There's definitely going to be a continuation of the access guide. The next form that it takes is going to be a surprise, but we are going to continue this because of what it has done for the industry so far, what it will continue to do, and Black comic lords will be included.
Well, thank you. It's nice to know that we rate a mention.
You do rate a mention.
Thank you. But yeah, this is a dope book. I mean, I highly recommend it. I mean, what's amazing is you even talk about storylines. Like, here are the major storylines involving Black characters. You know,
yeah.
All the books that are in there, all the books, everything that we put in our page is kind of in this book. It's amazing.
Thank you. And you know,
information.
It's a lot of work. We're not getting paid for it, so it's fine. It's finding these pockets of time to do it. I really have to give a lot of credit to George Carmona III, who is not only the designer, but he also does quite a bit of the research. So it's really a team effort. And to answer Azel Ray's question, Everyone Comics is in Astoria. I'm almost positive it is in Astoria, Queens. But yeah, so, you know, this book is a continuation of the mission, right? It's, you know, awareness. The industry for so long, like, kept us a bit of a secret. You didn't know which creators were Black. I didn't know Dennis Cowan was Black until I met him working at Milestone. That's a fact.
Right.
I had his first work at Marvel Comics, which I think was Power Man and Iron Fist number 80, I think. I own the Question, but there was no Wizard magazine at the time or whatever, so I never saw pictures of him. And because of how the industry, because of how I allowed myself as a human being to be brainwashed and how society brainwashes us, it brainwashes us to default identity as white until it's proven that it's not.
You know, you mentioned something that's really cool. And I mention this all the time. And I'm actually, as we're thinking about what we're going to do with Black Comic Lords this year, one of the ideas that pops into my head is the idea is a lot of people don't know who are Black comic creators. I mean, we see these names on these books. You don't know who's Black and who's not sometimes. And there really needs to be, I remember back in the day in like, in the Bronze Age comics, what have you, they used to have like the bullpen page in the back and where they have like a creator highlight. And that's how I found out about Dwayne McDuffie. I'm like, wait, that dude's Black.
That's right. Right. It was like
version of him. Right. They had a cartoon version, and that's how I would find out that various creators are Black. Until I saw that, I would never know. I always suspected, based on how dope he drew Black people, that Mark Bright was Black. It took me years to figure that out. But it was Mark Bright that got me collecting Iron Man at one point.
Yes. Yes.
So having that in a book like this, us having that on our website, I think is tremendously important.
Please do it. Please do it.
Yeah.
Because people need to see that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We'll share information.
Okay, there you go. There you go. Richard Wright is doing his deep dive, Power Man and Iron Fist 88. I mean, honestly, I don't remember what issue 88 is. I think his first issue 80, I think, had a villain named Warhawk. And I think Power Man, Luke Cage was holding Danny Iron Fist's unconscious body, and he was looking up, and he was framed by this silhouette. And I think the silhouette was of a guy named Warhawk. There's
a and Richard might be able to know the answer to this. There's an issue of Power Man and Iron Fist that made history, if I'm not mistaken. Christopher Priest wrote it, and I think, was it Dennis Cowan did the art? Or was it? I
think it would have been Mark Bright.
Was it Mark Bright? It was the first. It was the first time on a Marvel comic that a Black writer and a Black artist worked on that book. Worked on a book.
That would have been Christopher Priest when he went by Jim Owsley.
Jim Owsley, you're correct.
And Mark Bright. Yeah.
Mark Bright. Yeah. I forget if anyone in the chat remembers what issue number that is. That's an important thing.
I don't know which one was their first one, but I could tell you I remember one. I think it was issue 118. And the reason I remember this issue is because it had the best Colleen Wing sequence ever written in comics. And it actually taught me something. Like, Colleen was about to fight someone, and basically there was this overarching narrative that said, because Colleen is a samurai, so she had a samurai sword. I think it's a katana. And it said, the samurai doesn't sheathe their sword unless they intend to use it.
Right.
And they don't use it unless they intend to kill. And I never forgot that. Yep, that's the comic. I never forgot that. I was like, wow. And Colleen Wing had
118
been around. Yeah, 118. And Colleen had been around for years. Misty Knight and Colleen Wing are two of my favorite characters in comics. But Priest was the first one who wrote Colleen as a samurai.
Right.
And gave us the philosophy of a samurai.
So I'm going to show you the issue 4 issues before that.
Okay.
This one. 114.
Wow.
This was Christopher Priest and going by Jim Owsley and Billy Graham, the late great Billy Graham.
Oh, wow.
This was the very first Black duo creative team on a Marvel comic.
Wow.
So yeah.
That's mind-blowing.
And and this is not an expensive book. I mean, it should be, but
Wow.
anyone can pick this book up.
That's awesome.
That's a classic. That's a classic.
I just learned something. That's awesome.
That's what we do, man.
It's clear. I know it. I know.
All right. Well, we don't want to monopolize your time, Joe. We appreciate you coming out and speaking with us. Can you tell everybody where they can follow you and on your socials and contribute to your newest works?
Oh, thank you so much. So I'm Joe Illidge on Facebook, Joseph P. Illidge on Twitter, Illmaster1 on Instagram, and my website is josephillidge.com. The Illuminous website is illuminousideas.com. I will have a number of projects that I write or co-write coming out for the next 3 years at the very least. When they can be announced, I will discuss them, and then we can, have that conversation. But
we would love to have you back.
Well, thank you so much. I'm just really great being here with y'all. What you guys are doing is a real service. The industry needs it. Thank you so much. And it's just great to be able to kind of like continue the adventure and continue the fight, because as far as we've gotten in the last 30 years, there's more work to do. We have more miles to walk. The industry has more to do for us.
Yeah. Well, at the end of these shows, your buddy Jeffrey Thorne started this trend where we ask everyone to say, my name is Joe Illidge and I am a Black comic lord. Would you say that into the camera for us?
I can definitely do that. My name is Joe Illidge and I'm a Black comic lord.
Thank you. Welcome to the family.
Thank you so much. Happy to be here.
Thank you all for watching us. We hope you got something out of this video. If you like the content, please like, share, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and follow us on our various social media platforms. We've had a hell of a great time. It's been a lot of work. I ain't gonna lie. I mean, it's fun to watch these and do these, but all the work that goes into preparing these interviews is tremendous. You guys have no idea. But it's been a blessed time, and we've really enjoyed it. If you want to watch any of our prior works, the recent specials we did with John Jennings, Eve Hewitt, Cody Ziegler, Jeffrey Thorne, Sebastian Jones, our special roundtable series we've done. We talked a lot about Milestone tonight. I don't know if you know, Joe, we did a Milestone roundtable series. They're going over all the major Milestone books.
I do know. I have to watch that. I'm familiar with those books, but now watching more of what y'all do, I can't wait to hear your perspective, especially since you, Paul, were there from day one.
Yeah. So I recommend you watch it. I think you'll get a kick out of it.
All right,
Mike Davis stopped by, Jeffrey Thorne stopped by, Chris Cross came by on one of them as well.
Oh, man, that's awesome.
We've got our recurring happy hour. Geez, I gotta start it up. I've been so busy with these interviews. I haven't had a drink on this show in a while. Wakanda whiskey and blurred them. But I do have a new bottle for those who watch the show of stuff we'll get into. Real Talk with Rich. You might have seen Rich in the chat. He's our OG member with a tremendous show. He usually does it on Sunday nights. He's going to have an announcement on some major changes on that platform. That's going to be really cool.
Wow.
And we have our Black Comic Lords Ladies Lives. Tamiko heads that up. Our moderator, Tamiko, Star Dancer, tremendous show. There's a lot of content there, so I encourage all of you to check it out, and please like the videos and subscribe to the channel. So with that, thank you again, Joe, for spending time with us. We wish you well in all your endeavors, and we look forward to having you back here.
Thank you so much. It's been a great time.
All right.
Thank you.
Derek, we out.
Take us out.